Introduction. There is a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from spending years living beside your own life, without ever fully stepping into it. Most of us don't notice when it begins. It happens one ordinary morning, while we're hurrying out the door, or standing in line at the grocery store, already thinking about what comes next, or washing the same coffee cup we've washed 1,000 times, without seeing the light falling across the kitchen counter. Little by little, we become experts at arriving everywhere except the place where we actually are. This story isn't about escaping to a distant mountain or discovering a secret that changes everything overnight. It begins on an ordinary street, in an ordinary neighborhood, with ordinary people whose names will slowly become familiar. A man who waves every morning. A grocer who remembers what everyone likes to buy. A little girl who believes birds recognize her. A cracked cup no one throws away. A train that passes through town every day without waiting for anyone. Nothing remarkable. At least, not at first. But if you've ever wondered why life can feel strangely empty, even when everything seems to be in order. If you've ever carried old conversations longer than the people who spoke them. If you've ever looked around your own home and realized you've been somewhere else in your mind for years, then perhaps this story has been waiting for you. It isn't a story that promises to fix your life. It offers something quieter than that. An invitation to slow down, to notice, to remember. And perhaps, by the time you reach the final page, you'll discover that the place you've been searching for was never somewhere else. It has been quietly waiting for you, right where you are. Welcome to the house that was always home. The house that was always home. Prologue. Before the kettle begins to sing. Most mornings begin so quietly that we hardly notice ourselves arriving in them. Long before the first email. Before the news finds its way into the living room. Before a neighbor starts a lawn mower somewhere down the street. There is a small stretch of time when the world has not yet asked anything of us. The old kettle sits on the stove exactly where it was left the night before. The kitchen window is still dark except for the faint blue hint of dawn. A ceramic mug with a thin crack near its handle waits beside the coffee tin. You keep meaning to replace it, but somehow you never do. It still holds coffee just fine. When the burner clicks to life, the house gives its familiar replies. A floorboard settles upstairs. The refrigerator hums. Somewhere outside, a robin lands on the fence before anyone else on the street is awake. These sounds are so ordinary that they almost disappear. Until the morning you finally listen. Across the street, Mr. Collins is already on his porch, wrapped in the same faded green cardigan he has worn every spring for as long as anyone can remember. He lifts one hand when he notices you looking through the window. Not a big wave. Just enough to say, "I'm still here." You wave back. You don't know that he still sets out 2 coffee cups every Sunday before remembering he has lived alone for nearly 4 years. He doesn't know that some mornings you stand in your own kitchen long after the kettle has begun to sing, wondering why your mind feels heavier than the day in front of you seems to deserve. People rarely know these things about one another. We carry invisible weather. The woman jogging past the mailbox with her headphones on. The teenage cashier at Rose's grocery trying to smile through a difficult week. Jake, the mail carrier, who always whistles the same old tune while delivering letters he never gets to read. Each of them walks through the morning carrying rooms no one else can see. Perhaps you do too. For a long time, I believe peace was something people discovered after they solved enough problems. After the mortgage was paid. After the children grew up. After the doctor's appointment turned out fine. After the apology was finally spoken. Life has a gentle way of undoing ideas like that. Because the problems change. The seasons change. Even the people we love change. Yet every now and then, usually in moments too ordinary to photograph, something unexpected happens. You notice the warmth of the mug in your hands. The smell of toast drifting from the kitchen. The first light touching the maple tree outside. Nothing remarkable has happened. Still, for a brief moment, you are entirely here. That moment is easy to overlook. It lasts only a breath or two before the mind begins making lists, revisiting yesterday, rehearsing tomorrow. But what if those quiet seconds are not interruptions? What if they are the doorway? This is not a story about escaping your life. It is not about becoming someone calmer, wiser, or untouched by sorrow. It is about returning to the life that has been waiting beneath your habits of rushing, worrying, and trying to become someone else. It begins in an ordinary neighborhood, on an ordinary street, in an ordinary kitchen, just before the kettle begins to sing. Chapter 1. The hallway that waited every morning. Every house has a sound it makes before anyone speaks. Some wake with the soft ticking of old pipes warming beneath the floor. Others begin with the distant rattle of an aging furnace or the gentle complaint of wooden boards adjusting to another day. In this neighborhood, where most of the homes had been standing longer than the children who now rode bicycles past them, mornings arrived slowly, as though the street itself preferred not to be hurried. The kettle was always first. It never whistled all at once. It started with a faint murmur, almost shy, as tiny bubbles gathered somewhere deep inside the metal. Then came a quiet hiss. Only after a minute or two did it finally lift its familiar song into the stillness of the kitchen. That sound had become part of your life long ago. You could have slept through it. You could have ignored it. Most mornings, you did. The mug waiting beside the stove had a hairline crack running from its handle toward the middle. Friends had suggested replacing it years ago. It'll break one day, someone once said. Maybe they were right. Still, every morning you reached for the same mug. Not because it was special, simply because your hand already knew where to find it. Outside, dawn spread across the quiet street with patient confidence. The maple tree in front of Mr. Collins' house caught the first light long before the rest of the block. Sparrows bounced through the branches with an urgency that seemed unnecessary. Somewhere farther away, a garbage truck sighed to a stop. A dog barked once, then thought better of continuing. Life rarely announces itself with grand entrances. More often, it arrives disguised as routine. You opened the front door just long enough to collect the newspaper. The air still carried the coolness of the night. It smelled faintly of damp earth and fresh-cut grass. Someone nearby had already started brewing coffee. The scent drifted through the neighborhood, impossible to trace to any single kitchen. Across the street, Mr. Collins was watering the flower box beneath his front window. He wore the same faded green cardigan despite the warming weather. When he noticed you, he lifted the watering can slightly. Morning. Morning. That was all. No conversations about politics. No complaints about aching knees. No discussion of the forecast. Just one word exchanged between two people who had shared the same street for years without ever fully knowing one another. After a moment, he bent down to straighten one of the tulips. He treated flowers the way some people handled old photographs, with careful hands and an understanding that delicate things rarely responded well to force. You wondered, not for the first time, whether anyone had ever cared for him that gently. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. The mind is like that. It brushes against something true, then rushes away before we have time to notice. Inside, the hallway waited exactly as it always had. A pair of shoes leaned against the wall where they had been kicked off the evening before. A light jacket still hung from the wooden hook by the door, even though spring no longer required it. Dust floated lazily through a narrow beam of sunlight crossing the floor. Nothing had changed, yet somehow the hallway never felt empty. It felt expectant, as if it quietly watched every morning to see which version of you would walk through it. The one already worried. The one replaying yesterday's conversation before breakfast. The one mentally organizing an afternoon that had not yet begun. Or, every now and then, the one who simply noticed the warmth of bare feet against old wooden floors. Most people believe their day begins when they leave the house. In truth, it begins much earlier. It begins with the very first sentence the mind whispers before anyone else has spoken. Sometimes the sentence is practical. Don't forget the appointment. Sometimes it is anxious. I hope today goes better than yesterday. And sometimes it arrives so quietly you mistake it for your own voice. You're behind. You should have done more with your life by now. You always make things harder than they need to be. The strange thing about these thoughts is not that they appear. Every mind produces weather. The strange thing is how quickly we stop noticing that they are only thoughts. By the time the toast pops from the toaster, the courtroom is already in session. Evidence is presented. Old mistakes are called back to testify. Future failures are predicted with surprising confidence. The verdict is almost always the same. Not good enough. The hallway has watched this trial every morning for years. It has seen people rush through carrying briefcases, backpacks, grocery bags, diaper bags, bouquets of flowers, moving boxes, and hospital envelopes. It has watched children leave for their first day of school and later return home taller than the marks penciled onto the kitchen doorway. It has watched couples laugh, then stop laughing. It has watched one coat disappear forever after someone passed away. Hallways witness more lives than photographs ever do. They never interrupt. They simply remain. Later that morning, you stopped by Rose's grocery for milk. The bell above the door gave its familiar little ring. Warm air carrying the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolled toward you. Behind the register, Rosa greeted every customer by name. "Morning, Daniel. Good to see you, Mrs. Alvarez. How's your grandson doing?" She never seemed rushed. Not even on Saturdays. Near the bakery shelves, a little girl stood on tiptoe, trying to choose between two pastries, while her father pretended not to notice the serious decision taking place. An elderly woman counted coins into her palm one at a time before smiling apologetically at the cashier. Jake, the neighborhood mail carrier, stepped inside just long enough to buy a bottle of water. He nodded toward everyone in line as though greeting old friends. No one here knew every chapter of anyone else's story. Still, everyone carried one. Perhaps that was enough. On the walk home, the paper bag grew warm against your arm. A breeze carried the scent of lilacs from somewhere you couldn't see. Without thinking, your hand reached for your phone. There was no message you were expecting. Nothing urgent. Only habit. Your fingers stopped halfway. For reasons you couldn't explain, you lowered your hand again. Instead, you listened. A bicycle chain clicking as someone coasted downhill. Wind moving through young leaves. The distant whistle of the morning train crossing the river. Your own footsteps on the sidewalk. It lasted less than 20 seconds. Then the mind returned with tomorrow's errands, unfinished conversations, and quiet worries that had followed you for years. But something had happened. Not a revelation. Not peace. Only a small interruption. A crack in the habit of leaving the present before it had fully arrived. Most people spend their lives searching for extraordinary moments while quietly walking past thousands of ordinary ones that were trying to save them. The hallway had always been waiting. Not to trap you in the past. Not to keep you inside the house. Only to offer one silent invitation every morning before the front door opened. Leave if you must. Just don't leave yourself behind. Chapter 2. The Neighbor Who Always Waved. For years, you thought you knew Mr. Collins. Not well. Just enough. He lived across the street in the white house with blue shutters that needed repainting every few summers. He kept his lawn trimmed, but never too perfectly, as if he believed grass should still be allowed to look like grass. Every October, he raked his leaves into careful piles, only to watch the neighborhood children scatter them again before sunset. He never seemed to mind. Each morning, sometime between the kettle's first whisper and the school bus arriving at the corner, he stepped onto his porch with a steaming mug balanced between both hands. Then he waved. Always the same wave. 2 fingers lifted from the side of the cup. Never dramatic. Never forgotten. Some mornings you returned the gesture. Some mornings your thoughts were already too busy to notice. He waved anyway. It is strange how easily we mistake familiarity for knowing someone. You can watch the same person for 10 years and never learn what keeps them awake at 2 in the morning. You can exchange greetings 1,000 times without ever hearing the sentence that changed their life. One Tuesday in early April, rain settled over the neighborhood before sunrise. Not a storm. Just one of those patient rains that seemed content to stay all day. The sidewalks darkened. The maple leaves collected shining drops along their edges. The birds sounded almost surprised to find the morning still waiting for them. You almost skipped your walk. Instead, you grabbed the old navy jacket hanging beside the front door and stepped outside anyway. Halfway down the block, you found Mr. Collins kneeling beside his mailbox. One of the wooden posts had begun to lean. "You need a hand?" He looked up and smiled. "I've been arguing with this thing for 20 minutes. You laughed. "The mailbox winning?" "So far." Together you steadied the post while he packed fresh soil around its base with the back of a small shovel. Neither of you spoke much. The rain filled the quiet spaces between words. Cars hissed gently along the wet road. Somewhere nearby a screen door slammed. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez hurried toward her car carrying a casserole covered with aluminum foil. She waved with her elbow because both hands were full. Life continued in all its ordinary directions. When the mailbox finally stood straight again, Mr. Collins brushed the mud from his gloves. Coffee. It wasn't really a question. You followed him across the street. His kitchen looked smaller than you expected. The wallpaper had faded where afternoon sunlight reached it every summer. A calendar still hung beside the refrigerator, though it was turned to last month. On the windowsill sat 3 tiny pots of herbs that seemed determined to survive despite receiving only half a day of sunlight. The coffee smelled strong. There were 2 mugs already sitting on the table. Mr. Collins froze. Only for a second. Without saying anything, he picked one up and returned it to the cupboard. The movement was so practiced that it almost disappeared. Almost. He noticed you noticing. My wife always drank from the blue one, he said quietly. You looked toward the cupboard. I still set it out sometimes. No embarrassment. No attempt to explain. Just the truth, offered the way someone might mention the weather. I suppose habits don't ask for permission. The room became still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. The kettle clicked as it cooled. I've tried stopping, he continued. For a while I thought I should. Friends said it would help me move on. Did it? He smiled into his coffee. No. Another silence. A comfortable one this time. They were looking at the mug, he said. I was missing the person. There are conversations that change nothing. And then there are conversations that quietly rearrange the furniture inside your heart. This was the second kind. Before that morning, grief had always seemed loud in your imagination. Crying, funerals, empty bedrooms. But sitting across from Mr. Collins, you realized grief often wore ordinary clothes. It watered flowers, straightened mailboxes, bought birdseed, paid electric bills, remembered birthdays no one else remembered anymore. Sometimes it simply reached for the wrong coffee mug. Later, while drying the dishes, Mr. Collins pointed toward the refrigerator. Family photographs covered nearly every inch of the door. Children, grandchildren, camping trips, Christmas dinners. A faded picture of a younger couple standing beside a station wagon, both laughing at something beyond the frame. You ever notice photographs never capture the quiet parts? He asked. You looked closer. They catch birthdays, weddings, vacations. He nodded. But they never show Tuesday mornings. He smiled. And that's where most of life happens. On the walk home, those words stayed with you. Tuesday mornings. Not birthdays. Not retirements. Not the days everyone remembers. Just the ordinary hours we usually hurry through without looking closely enough. That afternoon, Rose's grocery was busier than usual. Jake was sorting parcels near the entrance while chatting with a little boy who insisted every package contained treasure. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the bakery deciding between rye bread and sourdough. A teenager stocked soup cans while quietly singing along with music only he could hear through one earbud. Every face seemed somehow different now. Not because they had changed, because your way of seeing them had. You wondered who had once occupied the empty chair in Mrs. Alvarez's dining room. What memory Jake carried every time he whistled that old tune during his mail route. Why Rosa always smiled when customers entered but stared thoughtfully out the window whenever the store grew quiet. Questions without answers. Perhaps that was enough. That evening, after dinner, you found yourself standing on the front porch longer than usual. The rain had stopped. Water still clung to the branches, catching the last amber light of the day. Across the street, Mr. Collins stepped outside carrying a small bag of birdseed. He scattered a handful beneath the maple tree. Within moments, sparrows arrived from nowhere at all. He watched them without moving, without reaching for his phone, without trying to make the moment into anything larger than it was. Just an old man feeding birds before sunset. You raised your hand. He looked up. The same small wave. The same quiet smile. This time, before turning back inside, you noticed something you had somehow missed for years. It wasn't that Mr. Collins waved because life had been kind to him. He waved because kindness was the way he had chosen to answer life. There is a difference. One depends on circumstances. The other becomes a way of living. Perhaps every neighborhood has someone like him. Someone whose greatest gift is not wisdom spoken aloud, but steadiness quietly practiced. Someone who reminds us, without ever intending to, that the heart does not become gentler after suffering has ended. It becomes gentler when suffering no longer has the final word. The next morning, before the kettle began to sing, you found yourself looking across the street. The porch was empty. For a brief moment, you felt unexpectedly concerned. Then the front door opened. Mr. Collins stepped outside with his familiar mug. He looked up, 2 fingers lifted from the side of the cup. Morning. Nothing extraordinary had happened. And yet, somehow, the street felt a little more like home. Chapter 3. The letter hidden inside the cookbook. Some memories wait politely. They don't interrupt your day or demand your attention. They settle into ordinary places, a coat pocket, the back of a drawer, a box in the attic you keep meaning to organize. And sometimes, they choose a cookbook. No one in the neighborhood knew exactly when Eleanor stopped baking pies. People noticed gradually. The smell of cinnamon no longer drifted through her kitchen on Sunday afternoons. The cooling rack that once sat by the window disappeared from sight. Even the robins seemed to spend less time perched on the fence outside her yard, as though they, too, remembered the crumbs she used to scatter each morning. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for almost 6 years. Cancer, someone had said, quietly. The way people speak about illnesses that arrive slowly enough to rearrange a life before anyone realizes it has changed. Eleanor rarely talked about him, not because she wished to forget. Some stories become too woven into the fabric of a person to be retold every time someone asks. They simply become the way that person pours tea, folds laundry, or pauses before answering the telephone. One cool Thursday morning, Rosa mentioned that Eleanor hadn't been feeling well. "If you stop by," she said while slipping a loaf of sourdough into a paper bag, "take her some oranges. She always says she doesn't need anything." Rosa smiled. "And she always does. So you knocked that afternoon." It took a little longer than usual before the door opened. "There you are," Eleanor said, as though she had been expecting someone, even if she hadn't known who. Her silver hair was tied back loosely. She wore an old blue cardigan with one missing button and flour dusted lightly across one sleeve. "I was trying to remember how Thomas used to make pie crust." "You baking again?" "I'm trying." She laughed softly. "The recipe remembers better than I do." Her kitchen felt different from anyone else's. Not cleaner, not older, just lived in. A bowl of apples rested on the table beside a folded newspaper. A tiny radio near the sink murmured jazz through gentle static. A wooden rolling pin, smooth from decades of use, lay beside a mixing bowl as though someone had only stepped away for a moment. The windows were cracked open an inch. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower hummed. Eleanor reached for a thick cookbook with a faded red cover. "I've had this since 1978. She smiled. "I still open it to recipes I already know." She flipped through familiar pages stained with butter, vanilla, and little fingerprints from another lifetime. Halfway through the dessert section, something slipped free. A folded envelope. Cream-colored. Thin with age. It landed quietly on the table between you. Neither of you moved. For a long moment, Eleanor simply looked at it. "I forgot this was here." The handwriting across the front was unmistakably personal. For Eleanor. No address. No stamp. Just her name. She unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, as though paper could bruise. The ink had faded in places. Thomas had written it more than 30 years earlier while traveling for work. It wasn't a love letter in the dramatic sense. There were no grand declarations. No poetry. Instead, he had written about ordinary things. He hoped the tomatoes in the garden were surviving the heat. He wondered if the dog still barked at squirrels every morning. He apologized for forgetting to take out the trash before leaving. Near the bottom of the page, he had added one final sentence. "Save me one slice of apple pie. I'll be home before the weekend." Eleanor smiled. Then she cried. Not loudly. Not the kind of tears that ask someone else to fix them. just quiet tears that had apparently been waiting for permission. I must have tucked it into the cookbook, she whispered, so I'd find it while baking. She laughed through the tears. I suppose I finally did. Outside, the wind stirred the maple leaves. The radio continued playing as though nothing remarkable had happened. Maybe nothing remarkable had. A woman had found an old letter. That was all. And yet the room felt gently altered. After a while, Eleanor folded the letter again. Not to hide it, only to hold it. You know, she said, looking toward the window, people think missing someone fades in a straight line. She shook her head. It doesn't. Some days I go hours without thinking of him. She smiled. Then I'll hear someone whistle while fixing a fence, or smell coffee brewing before sunrise, and suddenly it's as if he's just stepped into the next room. She paused. I used to think that meant I wasn't healing. What do you think now? I think love remembers. The pie eventually made its way into the oven. The crust wasn't perfect. One edge cracked before Eleanor could crimp it into place. She noticed. Then, to your surprise, she left it exactly as it was. Thomas always said homemade pies should look like they had a story. The kitchen slowly filled with the scent of apples, butter, and cinnamon. Warm. Familiar. Almost enough to make time feel softer around the edges. While the pie baked, someone knocked at the back door. It was Maya from 2 houses down, balancing an empty glass bowl in both hands. My mom wanted to know if you had any sugar. Eleanor laughed. I have enough to keep this whole street baking. She filled the bowl. Before Maya left, Eleanor cut a small piece of leftover dough. Here. What is it? Sprinkle cinnamon on it. Bake it for 10 minutes. My grandmother used to call them baker's treats. Maya's eyes lit up. Can I tell Mom? I hope you do. When the door closed again, Eleanor watched the girl skip back across the yard. You see, she said quietly, recipes don't really belong to us. They travel. That evening, carrying a still warm slice of pie wrapped carefully in parchment paper, you walked home beneath a sky turning the color of faded denim. The neighborhood moved through its ordinary rituals. A father washed his pickup truck while his son sprayed water at everything except the truck. Jake rolled slowly past in the mail van, lifting 2 fingers from the steering wheel. Mr. Collins was replacing a loose board on the bird feeder beneath the maple tree. Somewhere a screen door slammed. Somewhere someone laughed. None of it seemed extraordinary, yet all of it belonged. Back in your own kitchen, you placed the pie beside the cracked ceramic mug. The house was quiet. Almost. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, rain clouds gathered somewhere beyond the hills. Without really intending to, you opened one of your own drawers. Inside lay an old grocery receipt, a postcard from years ago, a birthday card written in handwriting you hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, you simply looked. You didn't sort anything. You didn't throw anything away. You only realized something that had been true all along. Objects are patient. They never ask us to remember. They simply wait until we're ready. Before going to bed, you wrapped the rest of the pie and placed it in the refrigerator. As you turned off the kitchen light, the smell of cinnamon still lingered in the room. Tomorrow, the pie would be a little less warm. The letter would return to its envelope. Morning would come as it always did. But somewhere between a stained cookbook, an imperfect crust, and a sentence written decades ago, you had learned something that no photograph could have taught. The people we love rarely remain inside the grand moments we try so hard to preserve. They linger instead in the way we measure flour without looking, in the cup we instinctively place on the table, in the recipes we still make even when no one is coming for dinner. Perhaps that is why ordinary things become sacred. Not because they are rare, because they quietly continue carrying love long after the people who first placed it there are gone. Chapter 4. The room upstairs where old voices sleep. There was a room upstairs you almost never entered. Not because it frightened you. Life had simply taught you to close the door and keep walking. It had become the place where unfinished things went. Boxes that would someday be sorted. Winter blankets folded into neat stacks. A lamp that still worked if you tapped it twice. A clock that had stopped at 3:17 for reasons no one could remember. Most houses have a room like this. A place that quietly collects the pieces of yesterday until yesterday begins to feel permanent. One Saturday morning, after several days of steady rain, sunlight finally returned. The neighborhood seemed relieved. Windows opened. Fresh sheets fluttered from clotheslines. Somewhere nearby, someone was tuning an old guitar on their porch. The notes drifted in and out with the breeze, imperfect but warm. You carried a cardboard box upstairs. Only one. That had become a quiet promise to yourself over the years. Never try to organize an entire life in one afternoon. Just one box. The room smelled faintly of cedar, old paper, and the dry sweetness of wood that had spent decades warming in summer and cooling in winter. Dust floated through the light pouring from the small window beneath the roof. It looked less like neglect than patience. The first box held Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowing newspaper. The second contained extension cords that had somehow multiplied over the years. The third was heavier. Photographs. Old receipts. A baseball glove with a broken lace. A cassette tape labeled simply, Road Trip 89. You smiled. There wasn't even a cassette player left in the house. Yet somehow you had kept the tape. Beneath it sat a small portable radio. Its plastic had faded to a soft cream color. One corner was cracked. The antenna leaned slightly to one side. You remembered listening to baseball games through its tiny speaker on summer evenings when the windows stayed open long after sunset. You turned the dial. Nothing. Only static. Then, for just a second, a voice. Faint. Gone before you could recognize it. You laughed at yourself. Old radios have a way of making ghosts out of ordinary signals. Downstairs, the kettle began to sing. The sound drifted upward through the hallway. Familiar. Present. Real. You thought about carrying the radio down to the trash. Instead, you set it beside the window. Not everything has to prove it is useful before we allow it another season. As the morning unfolded, you found smaller things. A movie ticket folded inside a paperback novel. A birthday candle no one had used. A grocery list written in hurried handwriting. Milk. Eggs. Bread. Light bulbs. Call Mom. You stared at those last two words longer than you expected. Call Mom. Such an ordinary reminder. At some point it had become impossible. You couldn't remember whether you had made the call that day. You hoped you had. Memory is strange that way. It preserves the shape of a feeling while quietly erasing the facts around it. Outside, laughter echoed from the sidewalk. Maya and another girl were drawing flowers with colored chalk. Their artwork stretched across the concrete in bright blues, pinks, and yellows. Every few minutes they stepped back to admire it before adding another petal. Neither seemed concerned that tomorrow's rain would wash everything away. Children understand impermanence long before they know the word. Adults simply forget. You returned to the box. Near the bottom lay a pair of hiking boots. The leather had stiffened. Mud still clung stubbornly to the soles despite the passing years. You remembered the trail, the overlook, the way everyone had insisted on taking photographs before anyone simply stood still long enough to see the valley. It occurred to you how often memory edits a story. It keeps the beautiful view. It forgets the aching knees. It remembers the argument. It forgets the apology that came an hour later. It holds tightly to embarrassment. It lets kindness slip quietly into the background. Perhaps memory isn't trying to deceive us. Perhaps it simply needs help remembering everything. The loudest voice in the room had never come from the boxes. It came from somewhere much closer. You should have visited more often. You should have said thank you. You shouldn't have made that decision. You knew better. The sentences arrived with remarkable confidence, as though they had spent years rehearsing. You set the hiking boots on the floor, sat down, and listened, not to the accusations, to the sound beneath them. The room itself was quiet. Wind brushed gently against the roof. A mourning dove called from somewhere beyond the maple tree. The old floor settled with a soft creak. The voice wasn't coming from the room. It wasn't coming from the boots, or the photographs, or the grocery list. It was coming from memory, trying to protect you in the only language it had ever learned. Years ago, perhaps those harsh reminders had seemed useful. Don't make that mistake again. Be more careful next time. Work harder. Try harder. Stay alert. Somewhere along the way, caution had slowly transformed into identity. The warning had become a name. You were careless. You were disappointing. You always ruined things. The change happened so gradually that you stopped hearing it happen. A knock at the front door interrupted the silence. By the time you reached the hallway, Jake was standing on the porch with a small package tucked beneath one arm. Afternoon. Afternoon. Found this behind the sorting shelf at the post office. He looked at the faded label. Thought it deserved a better ending than collecting dust. You laughed. So did I. After he left, you carried the package inside. The return address had long since faded. Inside was a small wooden picture frame you barely remembered ordering years before. Nothing extraordinary. Just another forgotten thing finding its way home. That evening, Mr. Collins wandered across the street carrying a screwdriver. Heard you wrestling with old boxes. You heard that. He smiled. Neighborhood's quieter than people think. Together you repaired the loose hinge on the hallway closet. The job took less than 15 minutes. When it was finished, neither of you hurried back inside. The porch held the last warmth of the day. Crickets had begun their evening chorus. Across the street, Rosa locked the grocery store and waved as she climbed into her car. You ever notice, Mr. Collins said, how old houses remember every version of us? You considered the question. The child running down the hallway. The teenager slamming doors. The parent carrying sleeping kids. The person standing alone after everyone else has gone. He rested both hands on the porch railing. The house remembers. Then he smiled. But it never judges. The sentence lingered long after he walked home. That night, before going upstairs, you paused outside the room beneath the roof. The door remained open. Moonlight reached just far enough inside to touch the old radio, sitting quietly on the windowsill. You realized something then. The room upstairs had never been filled with old voices. Only old echoes. Voices belong to people. Echoes belong to places where words have been repeated too many times. And echoes, unlike voices, slowly fade when no one keeps answering them. You turned off the hallway light. The room disappeared into darkness. Not hidden, simply resting. There would be other boxes, other memories, other afternoons when old echoes would rise again. That was all right. Healing, you were beginning to understand, was rarely the act of clearing every room. More often, it was learning which voices deserved a chair at the table, and which could finally be allowed to grow quiet. Chapter 5. Saturday at Rosa's Grocery. By Saturday morning, Rosa's Grocery had already been awake for hours. The lights came on before sunrise. Bread arrived while the streets were still empty. By 6:30, the coffee pot behind the counter had brewed its first full pot, and Rosa was arranging peaches into neat wooden crates with the kind of attention some people reserved for fresh flowers. You can always tell how the day's going to go by the peaches, she liked to say. No one knew exactly what she meant. No one asked. Some sayings are less about explanation than companionship. The little bell above the front door rang almost constantly. Neighbors drifted in carrying shopping lists folded into pockets, written on the backs of envelopes, or remembered only halfway. Saturday had its own rhythm. Children asked for cereal with cartoon characters on the box. Parents quietly put it back and reached for oatmeal instead. Someone always forgot milk. Someone always bought more bananas than they needed. Someone always stood in front of the soup shelf much longer than necessary, trying to decide between two cans that probably tasted almost the same. You found yourself lingering instead of hurrying. There was no real reason. The morning simply invited it. Fresh coffee mingled with the smell of oranges, newspaper ink, cinnamon rolls, and the faint, earthy scent of potatoes stacked near the entrance. The floorboards gave a familiar creak near the dairy aisle. The old refrigerator hummed with quiet determination. From a radio balanced above the register, a folk song played softly beneath the conversations. Not loudly enough to interrupt, just enough to keep silence company. Jake wandered in first, still wearing his postal uniform. He placed a carton of eggs, peanut butter, and a bag of dog treats on the counter. Morning, Rosa. You remembered the dog this week. The dog reminded me. Rosa laughed. I believe it. Jake leaned closer. I forgot my own lunch yesterday. But Max. He shook his head. I'd never hear the end of that. Across the store, Mrs. Alvarez examined tomatoes one by one as though each deserved an equal chance. An elderly man named Walter searched patiently for his reading glasses. They were resting on top of his head. No one hurried to tell him. It somehow felt kinder to let him discover them himself. Near the freezer section, Maya was trying to convince her father that ice cream counted as an essential grocery. "It has milk," she argued. "It has optimism," he replied. "I'm not sure that's a food group." "It should be." Even Rosa smiled at that one. The store wasn't large enough for anyone to remain a stranger for very long. People borrowed shopping carts from one another without asking. Someone held the door open. Someone picked up the orange another customer accidentally dropped. Tiny kindnesses passed through the aisles so naturally they almost escaped notice. Perhaps that is how communities survive. Not through grand gestures. Through habits that become invisible because they are practiced so often. Rosa finally looked up from the register. "You look less rushed." "I've been trying something." "Oh, not filling every quiet moment." She nodded as though you had told her the weather. "How's that going?" "Some days better than others." That's usually how worthwhile things go. She handed change to another customer before continuing. "When my husband was alive, he couldn't stand silence. I remember. He always had the television on, even if nobody was watching." She smiled toward the rows of canned vegetables. "After he died, I kept turning it on. For months. It made the house feel occupied. And then, one afternoon the power went out." She shrugged. "I sat there listening." "To what?" "The refrigerator winding down. Rain against the windows. A child riding a bicycle outside. The church bells 3 blocks away." She smiled to herself. "I realized the world had never actually been quiet." "I had." The word stayed with you long after the next customer stepped forward. There is a difference between silence and absence. Silence still contains life. You only begin to hear it after enough noise has left. Near the bakery, a young mother apologized because her toddler had knocked over a display of pasta. Before she could kneel, 3 people were already helping. Walter stacked boxes carefully despite still searching for his glasses. Jake caught runaway packages of spaghetti before they slid beneath the shelves. Maya collected elbows and shells as though gathering seashells on a beach. Within a minute, everything stood upright again. The little boy looked ready to cry. Rosa crouched beside him. "No harm done." She handed him a small clementine. "Helping counts more than spilling." He nodded with great seriousness. Children often believe what adults tell them about the world. Perhaps that is why the words we choose matter so much. Around noon, Eleanor arrived carrying an empty pie plate wrapped in a dish towel. "I've come to return this." Rosa looked offended. "You return library books. You don't return pie plates. You refill them." "I was hoping you'd say that." They laughed together. It occurred to you that some friendships were built less on conversation than repetition. Returning dishes. Sharing soup. Checking mail during vacations. Watering plants. Remembering birthdays. Showing up. Again and again. Outside, the farmer's market had begun setting up along the next block. Someone played a fiddle beneath a striped canopy. The scent of kettle corn drifted down the sidewalk. A golden retriever waited patiently outside the hardware store, greeting everyone as though welcoming them into town. You stepped outside carrying a paper bag filled with bread, coffee, and apples. The air had warmed. Across the street, Mr. Collins was comparing tomato seedlings with a young couple who had just bought their first house. "You'll lose a few," he was saying. "Everybody does. The trick isn't growing perfect tomatoes. It's planting again next spring." The couple laughed. You suspected they would remember that sentence years from now, though not because of gardening. A city bus sighed to a stop at the corner. An older woman stepped carefully onto the sidewalk with the help of the driver. Before the doors closed, he reminded her not to forget her umbrella. She smiled. "I was hoping somebody would." Little exchanges. Small enough to disappear by afternoon. Large enough to shape a life. On the walk home, your grocery bag felt pleasantly heavy against your arm. A loaf of bread still warm from the bakery. Coffee beans. Fresh parsley. A jar of raspberry jam Rosa insisted you try. The neighborhood shimmered beneath early autumn sunlight. Somewhere, someone was grilling onions. A screen door banged. Wind carried the smell of cut grass from 2 streets away. Nothing about the day would ever become a family story. No anniversaries would mark it. No photographs would preserve it. Years from now, you might forget which Saturday it was. You might forget what you bought. You might even forget the conversations. But something quieter would remain. Not the details. The feeling. The growing certainty that a life is rarely changed all at once. It is changed while waiting your turn at the register, while returning a pie plate, while helping gather scattered boxes of pasta from a grocery store floor. Back home, you unpack the groceries one item at a time. The bread went into the wooden box beside the stove. The apples settled into the blue ceramic bowl on the counter. You filled the kettle and set it on the burner. Soon its familiar whisper began to rise through the kitchen. Outside, afternoon lights stretched across the maple leaves. A few children rode bicycles in slow circles before dinner. Someone laughed from a nearby porch. You opened the window just a little wider. The house filled with sounds that had always been there. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing asking to be remembered. And yet, standing there with one hand resting lightly on the warm countertop, you found yourself wondering whether this was what peace actually looked like. Not the absence of unfinished things. Not a day without regret or longing. Simply a Saturday. A loaf of bread. Neighbors who knew your name. A kettle beginning to sing. And the quiet confidence that, for this one ordinary afternoon, there was nowhere else you needed to be. Before we continue our journey, let's pause here for today. We've just reached the end of the first 5 chapters of The House That Was Always Home. I hope these moments, these quiet reflections, and these characters have found a place in your heart. If you've enjoyed the story so far, I'd truly appreciate it if you could leave a like, share this video with someone who might need a moment of peace, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this channel grow and allows me to continue creating stories like this for you. Tomorrow, we'll return for the second half of our journey, where the final 6 chapters reveal the deeper meaning behind everything we've experienced together. Until then, take good care of yourself, slow down whenever you can, and remember, sometimes the place we're searching for has been with us all along. I'll see you in part 2.